Hamilton is struck on his right side. The bullet pierces his liver. He's done for. He died of internal bleeding with his wife and 7 children grieving around his bed. Hamilton's life was over, but in some ways it was actually just beginning. Like Christ, he rose again from the dead to assume a place in the firmament of American political history that I argue he would never have attained if he had died quietly at 80, as Burr did. His apotheosis was a triumph of spin, for his team was able to sell the idea that bang, bang meant that Hamilton was a murder victim, not the loser in a duel of honor, for he had refused to participate. More exactly, since this was a political matter, Hamilton was assassinated, a martyr. Hamilton had never shot to kill. He had fired spastically in the air after Burr shot him. His second, Pendleton, even retrieved a branch overhead that he claimed to have been severed by Hamilton's ball. The historian Joseph Ellis, however, has convincingly argued that the whole thing went down quite differently. Hamilton had indeed thrown away his fire, as the saying goes, as he said he would in his distaste for dueling, by shooting well away from Burr, but Burr couldn't tell that he had actually tried to miss, a failure to communicate. By the rules of the duel, Hamilton could not fire again until Burr had squeezed off his round, so he took his time, aimed. This explanation doesn't go that much better for Burr, but at least he had stood up manfully to a gun he believed was leveled in his direction. Whatever the explanation, he was not hailed as a hero for defending his honor, but indicted for murder by the Manhattan coroner who handled such things and had been forced to flee the city. He traveled in disguise under an assumed name clear to Georgia to escape the newspapermen who sought to out him, and lawmen bent on arresting him for murder and hauling him back to Manhattan to face charges. I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if our present politicians could resolve their differences so neatly? Whether it's bang bang or bang bang, it's over quickly without the terrible lingering of our own political controversies, like the one going on now between Donald Trump and any number of people. It used to be Jeb Bush and Megyn Kelly. Now he's on to Ted Cruz and Serge Kowalewski, that reporter for the New York Times. No bickering, no tweets, just bang bang. But a duel required an underlying assumption that doesn't exist today. And now we're going to go one layer down into the question of why did they duel? And that is a matter so long gone from contemporary life that we hardly even recognize it, like some strange artifact dug up under a subway line for anthropologists to puzzle over. Honor. It all depended on something called honor. No one, sadly, has honor anymore, certainly not any politician, not honor that he would die to defend. But honor was everything to a gentleman of the political class in 1804. Honor was pride, masculinity, reputation, valor, and 100 other things. It was their brand, except that it was the product of a lifetime, not the calculation of marketers. It was everything they imagined they stood for in life. They would sooner surrender their manhood than give up their honor. When Hamilton assailed Burr as a dangerous man, he was impugning Burr's honor. No words now can convey how threatening that was. When Burr called Hamilton out on it, he was doing the same. It was time for an interview, as they called it. But there was something else. Grief. For both men, the height of their political lives was behind them. Hamilton's Federalist Party was out of power, never to return to power, reducing Hamilton's influence commensurately. And Burr was likely finished as a politician, having lost the vice presidency and the election for governor. More wrenching still, just 3 years before, Hamilton's beloved son, Philip, had been killed in a duel defending his father's name. He used the very same guns that his father ultimately was killed with at Weehawken. It's sometimes said that Hamilton's death was suicide by duel, and I think there might be something to that. But for men, often grief is expressed as anger, and it may have been for a kind of solace that they went to the dueling ground. Now, how could these two canny inside players have gotten into such a sticky situation in the first place? Not why did they hate, but why did they hate so recklessly? Why could they not help themselves? They knew where the pit was. And yet they kept stepping toward it, not away. This took me almost 400 pages to explain, but the short of it is, the two personalities were at the point of greatest tension between sameness and difference. Greatest tension between sameness and difference. You're thinking, Anyone who has been in a family, however, knows what I'm talking about. Sibling rivalry, parent-child tensions, they all stem from it. The relationship between Hamilton and Burr can best be thought of if you think of them as brothers, who are basically similar, as many brothers are, and basically different, as many brothers are. Only more so. You bond over the similarities, you identify, you see yourself in your brother, but the differences can cause a break. Your brother doesn't respond as you would, and that can be irritating, or he succeeds where you didn't. So it was with Hamilton and Burr. In the case of these brothers, the differences are plenty apparent. Hamilton was, of course, a penniless immigrant from the fly-specked West Indian island of Nevis. Burr, a near aristocrat, the son of Aaron Burr Sr., the president of Princeton, and the grandson of the most celebrated theologian of the day, Jonathan Edwards. And it goes from there. The differences would have pushed them apart into separate realms, but their similarities brought them together into a binding fraternal rivalry. Besides being both short, about 5'6", and slim, they were both brilliant, extremely articulate, politically minded, ambitious, vain, handsome, and immensely attractive to the ladies. That said, the differences again. Hamilton was prolix, quick to dash off a 10,000-word treatise, and utterly transparent. He could neither tell a lie nor keep a secret. Burr was covert, a man of few words, and few of those written down, and many of them in code. Hamilton was a man of powerful ideology, so powerful it formed the basis of the first political party, the Federalists, and then inspired the second, the Republicans, in furious opposition. Burr was a man without any deeply held political philosophy at all, leaving him open to a charge of demagoguery he could never quite dispel. And then there was this. Back then, the United States was still mostly a wilderness, with a few dots in it for cities. Because of their, politically, it was even smaller, and Burr and Hamilton could not escape each other. I was saying, they're just down the street. Because of their talents and their ambition, they both rose in power and prominence. But if the reaches of power are an inverted cone, narrowing towards the tip, eventually there was not room for both of them, even as they could not escape each other. They were two wolves in a tight cage, all fangs. There is much more to it, of course, but I want to swerve into the present for a bit to answer the perennial question that authors face. Who cares? What does this story have to say about us today? Well, everything. Two polarized parties, the risk of a descent to mob rule, a divided country, a rancorous press. Sound familiar? Then is now. In our case, of course, it's more than that, as the Republicans face a polarization within the ranks of their party, not just with the Democrats. Still, nothing could be more divided than the period of the early Republic, where Republicans wore trousers and shook hands in greeting, and Federalists wore knee breeches and bowed, preferring not to touch. If a Federalist needed a loan, he went to a Federalist bank, like Hamilton's Bank of New York. A Republican would go to a Republican one, like the Manhattan Bank started by Aaron Burr. There were two radically different styles of medicine. The more traditional bloodletting espoused by Dr. Benjamin Rusk, the physician who doubled as a Republican politician, was the standard Republican remedy. And the newer, less invasive treatments of the Federalist Dr. Edward Ned Stevens, among others, were for Federalists. Federalists were generally high-born, men of property, Republicans more working class. Federalists revered England as the source of all propriety, social order, and effective government. Republicans believed passionately in France, whose revolution was thought, at least at first, to be a continuation of our own. We talk now about red states and blue states, but back then it was more like a red country and a blue country. They occupied the same landmass, but somehow didn't touch. One lesson of the duel is that governments are made up of men, and men are not always reliable. The founders were brilliant, but they could be foolish, headstrong, narrow-minded, vain, and everything else. Hamilton could be all of these, and Burr even more so. It was largely luck that if the individuals behind the war and the early government were imbalanced, the group was not. For this, I believe we have one man to thank, and without him, I am sure we would not have a country today. That's George Washington, whose preternatural confidence was the primary reason a gaggle of farmers could defeat the strongest military force in the world, and then had the equipoise to keep the fractious and egotistical geniuses in his government from tearing each other apart. either because Obama is not the man for the job or because he's not granted the authority. We lack that single unifying figure today. We don't feel quite so certain that things are in fundamental order, and so we look for that one strong man, and we may find him in the wrong place. I'm always surprised when I talk about this book how few people ask me anything about Burr. Measured in Hamilton terms, of course, I guess in a hall like this I shouldn't wonder, but measured in Hamilton terms, a political accomplishment, Burr rates near zero. Not absolute zero, though. He was the first to campaign in person for elective office, rather than go through intermediaries, as had been customary, and he was the first to get around the anti-democratic property requirements to vote in New York, as he devised a tontine by which would-be voters could, for pennies, purchase a tiny portion of real estate, no more than a square inch, to qualify to vote. Even without these innovations, I will confess that I did find Burr the more fascinating of the two. Hate to say it. As Milton discovered, Satan is the one you watch. Notice Gore Vidal did not write Hamilton. Hamilton can be too earnest, too clever, too bright to be much fun. A slacker and shameless libertine like Burr can come as a welcome relief. I sometimes think of the two as representing the difference between the two aesthetic periods on either side of 1800, roughly speaking. On the earlier side stands the neoclassical era of Mozart and Alexander Pope. It's all about balance and order and clarity. That's Hamilton. Every sentence of his expresses those qualities that to him conveyed eternal truths. Burr, by contrast, is a total romantic, like Byron or Schumann. He is a man of mad passions and mysterious depths. Hamilton thinks, Burr broods. And for that, Burr is the one I could more easily relate to. At a dinner party, I'd much rather sit by him. Hamilton would talk your ear off about some economic policy or other. Burr would gossip about the ladies. I find the tale of his last years after the duel to be tremendously moving. Not his secession campaign, trying to detach half the American landmass for his personal empire. That's just nuts. But afterwards, when he is in exile in Europe and down to his last sou and trying to decide whether to spend it on bread or a prostitute, and choosing the prostitute. So now, that letter to Theodore, just to look at it, three things are striking. First, that under the circumstances he could have written anything the least bit coherent. Second, that the penmanship is, as always, exquisite. And third, that it seems at first so casual, like a letter dashed off over breakfast. But as the letter goes on, it gets much deeper. Despite the circumstances, Hamilton did not refer to Burr by name. But the allusion is unmistakable when he declares that it would break his heart if the country were dismembered. At the time, Burr had been linked to the so-called Northern Conspiracy to break the New England states plus New York free of the Union as a separate country to be headed up by Aaron Burr. That never materialized, but Burr did embark on that Western conspiracy, going after the lands of the Louisiana Purchase for a private empire. That led to Jefferson's charges of treason against him, placing Burr in the rare position of having killed the head of one party, possibly to be killed by the head of the other. And in the letter to Theodore, Hamilton inveighed against democracy, surely an awkward reference from a founder of the Republic. But democracy was not the hallowed term it is now, where universal franchise is revered, even if it is not exercised, but contained the specter of an ignorant electorate that was open to manipulation by the unscrupulous, rather like now. He meant something closer to demagoguery, with Burr engaging in retail politics, the demagogue in question. If this is so, it offers an interesting gloss on the standard account. This duel wasn't purely personal, but the first battle in a war Hamilton was waging against everything that Burr stood for. To learn about Hamilton and Burr is to learn about America, yes, but also about the emotions that are always teeming under the surface of great leaders. Jealousy, ego, insecurity, ambition, lust. These are the passions that make people who they are and account for what they do. To identify them, to trace their source, and to see their consequence, this is, I think, the real work of history. And they are what I sought to capture in the book I call War of Two.